I am a college student, and at the time this happened, I was 22 years old and living alone in a rented house on the outskirts of a small town in Kansas. I had moved there because of college, since the rent was cheap and it was about 15 minutes from campus. The house was old, one of those light wooden houses with normal creaks and a backyard that was far too big for someone living alone. In the back, there was a concrete staircase that led down to the basement with a heavy door that was almost never used. I had been living there for about 4 months and my routine was very predictable. That night wasn't different at all, at least not at first. It was an ordinary early morning, cold, with that typical small-town silence after midnight. I was awake studying, with the house lit only by the dim light of the living room lamp. Around 2 in the morning, I felt thirsty and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The kitchen faced the back of the house with a glass door that led straight into the backyard. As I passed by it, I saw something that made me stop mid-step. There was a man sitting on the steps of the back staircase, directly in front of the glass door. He was just sitting there with his arms resting on his legs like someone waiting patiently. He didn't seem drunk or moving strangely, just sitting, looking straight into the house. For a few seconds, I thought my brain was playing tricks on me because of the exhaustion, but he didn't disappear, didn't move, and the feeling of being watched was very real. I stood there trying to understand what I was seeing, as my heart started beating faster. The kitchen light was off, so he could probably see me better than I could see his face. All I could make out was that he was an adult man, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled too low over his forehead. The backyard was partially lit by the moon, and the cold made the glass door feel even colder. My first reaction was to think that maybe he was lost or some local resident confusing the house. Even so, it didn't make sense for someone to be sitting there at 2 in the morning, in silence, staring inside. I felt that tightness in my stomach that comes when something is wrong, but you're still trying to rationalize it. I stood there for a few seconds, not knowing whether to hide or make some movement to show that I was there. I ended up turning on the backyard light, more out of impulse than courage. The light illuminated the entire yard and the steps, but the man didn't react. He didn't stand up, didn't turn his face, didn't make any gesture of surprise. He stayed seated exactly the same way, now fully visible. That was when I realized his face looked strange, not deformed but completely empty of expression. He didn't look startled at being seen, nor bothered by the light. That made me more nervous than if he had run away. I carefully closed the glass door, as if the noise might provoke something. I leaned my back against the kitchen counter, trying to take a deep breath, while my mind raced for explanations. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I would even say at that moment. A man sitting in my backyard doing nothing sounded minor even to me. I grabbed my phone and stared at the screen, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. Meanwhile, I listened for any sound coming from the back of the house. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. After a few minutes, curiosity and fear began to mix. I slowly went back to the glass door to look again. When I got closer, my stomach dropped completely. The steps were empty. The man was simply gone. I hadn't heard footsteps, the backyard gate creaking, or anything that suggested someone had stood up and left. The outdoor light was still on, illuminating the dew-damp concrete. The feeling wasn't relief, but alertness, as if something had changed places without me noticing. I pressed my face closer to the glass and noticed fresh footprints on the ground, leading from the steps toward the basement door. The prints ended exactly in front of the heavy door that led down to the sublevel. My first instinct was to back away, but I stood there for a few seconds staring at those marks on the concrete. They didn't look old or scattered across the yard. They were well defined, as if someone had walked slowly and carefully. The basement door was always locked from the outside, but I couldn't remember if I had checked it that day. The idea that someone might have gone there and could be inside the house started to make me nauseous. I went to the front door and checked the lock, then the windows. Everything was still locked. Even so, the house felt different, as if the air were heavier. I went back to the kitchen, trying to make as little noise as possible, feeling the cold creep up my feet. I didn't want to go down to the basement, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility that someone might be there. I grabbed an old flashlight from a drawer and stood in front of the basement door. The wood looked darker than usual, and I could smell a faint scent of dampness coming from below. I put my hand on the doorknob and realized it wasn't fully locked. My heart started racing so hard I almost lost my breath. I stood there for a few seconds listening to my own breathing echo in the hallway. I called out, "Is anyone there?" with the firmest voice I could manage, but it came out low and shaky. There was no response, no movement at all. Even so, I had the strange certainty that I wasn't alone in that house. I pulled my hand away from the knob and decided that going down at that moment would be the worst possible choice. I went back to the living room, blocked the basement door from the inside with a chair, and sat on the couch without turning off any lights. I grabbed my phone again and called a friend who lived a few blocks away, just to hear another voice. While I talked, my eyes kept drifting toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. I tried to sound calm on the call, but my hands were sweaty and my legs wouldn't stop shaking. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual. The wind made the wood groan, and I kept trying to tell that apart from any other sound. After a few minutes, I hung up and sat there waiting for something to happen. That was when I heard a low noise coming from the basement. It wasn't a loud bang or anything obvious. It sounded more like a slow shuffle, like feet adjusting on the floor. My stomach twisted instantly. I stood up and went to the front door, determined to leave the house if I heard anything else. Before opening it, I heard the noise stop suddenly. The silence returned, heavier than before. I waited a few seconds, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cold early morning air without looking back. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked a few blocks away, until the sun started to rise. When it was fully morning, I gathered the courage to return to the house. The cold had eased, and in the daylight everything looked more normal, almost too ordinary. I went in slowly, checking every corner, every door, expecting to find some obvious sign of a break-in. Nothing upstairs was out of place. The basement door was still closed, with the chair knocked over to the side, as if it had been pushed carefully. I took a deep breath and went down the steps with the flashlight on, smelling that strong scent of damp earth and mold. The basement was empty, but the concrete floor had fresh footprints leading to a dark corner. There was a small ventilation window there, open, with dirty handprints on the wall around it. I closed that window, went back upstairs, and packed a few things without thinking too much. That same day, I called the landlord and said I needed to move out as soon as possible. I didn't tell the full story, I just said I didn't feel safe there. He didn't ask many questions, which I found strange, but I took it as luck. I never went back to that house after picking up my things a few days later. To this day, what bothers me most isn't imagining who that man was. It's remembering how calmly he was sitting there, staring inside, as if he knew I would see him, and as if he had all the time in the world to decide when to leave. Story 2. I am a 29-year-old woman, and when this happened, I was living alone in an old apartment building in a medium-sized city in Illinois. I had moved into that apartment after a complicated breakup, looking for a cheap and quiet place to start over. The building was old, one of those built in the 1940s with thick walls, narrow hallways, and a constant smell of dust and cleaning products. My apartment was on the top floor, which was one of the reasons I chose that place. There wouldn't be anyone walking above me, no one dragging furniture, no one making noise late at night. I worked from home at the time, so I spent a lot of time inside the apartment, including during the day. The apartment was small but quiet, and during the first few months that was never a problem, until that night. Everything started around 1 a.m. on an ordinary weekday. I was already in bed with the lights off, trying to fall asleep. That was when I heard the first bang coming from the ceiling. It wasn't very loud, but it was sharp and clear, as if someone had hit the concrete with something solid. I thought it might be some structural noise from the building, which wasn't uncommon on cold nights. But a few seconds later, there was another bang, louder, followed by a dragging sound. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the dark, feeling that strange tension spread through my body. Something about it didn't feel normal. After that, the banging started happening more frequently, as if someone were moving back and forth directly above my head. The sound wasn't of light footsteps. It was heavy, irregular, with long pauses in between. Then I heard something that sounded like muffled voices, very low, almost swallowed by the thick ceiling. At first I thought it might just be my mind filling in the sounds, but then I clearly noticed the tone of an argument. I couldn't understand any words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. There was tension up there, like two people arguing in a restrained way. At some point I heard something break, a sharp crack, followed by the sound of something hitting the wall. My entire body tensed, and I sat up in bed without even realizing it. Right after that, I heard a sound that sent an immediate chill through me. Someone was crying. It wasn't loud. It was a muffled cry, as if the person were trying not to make noise. That lasted a few seconds, stopped, and then there was another impact, stronger, as if something heavy had been thrown onto the floor. The ceiling vibrated slightly. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my ears, and stood frozen in the middle of the bedroom. My first reaction was to think of domestic violence, someone hurting someone else up there. I grabbed my phone, unsure whether to call the police or try to talk to the building manager the next day. The noise continued for over half an hour that night, coming and going in waves. Sometimes it sounded like a more intense argument, with things being thrown or dragged. Then there would be a heavy silence. I couldn't bring myself to lie back down, so I sat on the living room couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where it was coming from. The entire building seemed quiet. I didn't hear doors opening, no one going up or down the stairs. Nothing besides whatever was happening above me. At some point, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep there with the lights on. I woke up a few hours later with my alarm and for a few seconds thought it had all just been a nightmare. Until I heard again a sharp bang above me, this time in broad daylight. My stomach dropped instantly. During the day, the noises continued intermittently. It wasn't constant, but it happened often enough to keep me on edge the entire time. Sometimes it sounded like someone walking in circles, other times like single blows, as if someone were punching the ceiling. I tried to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Early in the afternoon, I heard something heavy being dragged from one side to the other, slow and deliberate like a piece of furniture. That went on for several minutes, then suddenly stopped. That was when I decided I needed to talk to the building manager. I couldn't keep pretending it was just the building making noise. Late in the afternoon, I went down to the building's management office and explained the situation to the manager. I told him that for days I hadn't been able to sleep properly because of the banging and the arguments coming from the ceiling. I mentioned the crying, things breaking, and how the noise continued even during the day. As I spoke, I noticed his expression change, but not in the way I expected. He didn't seem annoyed or surprised, he looked confused. When I finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds, looking at me as if trying to find the right words. Then he told me very directly that there was no apartment above mine. He said that above the top floor there was only a technical space, completely empty and locked. I laughed nervously, thinking he must be joking or mixing up the apartments. I insisted there had to be some mistake because I was hearing voices, arguments, crying. He shook his head and said no. That space only had old pipes and beams. He also said that no one had access to the keys except maintenance, and that no one had been up there for years. I felt a chill run through my body as if something suddenly clicked into place. I asked if he could go up there with me to check just so I could be sure. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. While we waited for the janitor to get the keys, I heard another loud bang coming from exactly above my apartment. We went up together through the narrow stairs to the last landing, where there was usually no movement at all. The hallway ended at an unmarked metal door, different from the apartment doors. The janitor opened it with difficulty, making a loud noise that echoed through the empty space. What was inside didn't look like a place anyone could live. It was a low-ceilinged space with uneven surfaces, full of pipes, old wiring, and wooden beams covered in dust. The air was stale and heavy, smelling of rust and old dampness. There were no furnishings, no mattress, no signs that anyone had been there recently. Even so, while we were inside, I heard a sharp sound above us, like a blow coming from somewhere in the ceiling. The manager froze for a second, clearly hearing the same thing I did. He tried to brush it off, saying it was probably pipes expanding or some structural issue. But the sound came again, followed by what sounded like a short, dragging noise. There was nowhere for anyone to go in that space, nowhere to hide. We went back down in silence, and no one said anything else until we reached the ground floor. That night, I returned to my apartment with a constant feeling of alertness, as if I were being watched. Around midnight, the banging started again, stronger than before. This time there were no arguments, no crying, just regular blows directly above my bed. The banging continued for almost an hour, always in the same spot, as if someone were making their presence known. I lay there completely still, phone in hand, breathing shallowly, trying not to make any noise. Each bang made the bedroom light fixture vibrate slightly, which made me even more anxious. At times I thought I heard short footsteps between the bangs, but it could have been fear blending the sounds together. I got up to go to the bathroom and realized my legs were weak, as if I had been standing for hours. When I returned to the bedroom, the banging had suddenly stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. It felt like the entire apartment was waiting for something to happen. I stayed awake until almost dawn, unable to turn off the light or lie down again. When daylight came, I thought maybe it would stop, like it had the night before. But around 10 in the morning, I heard something different. It wasn't loud bangs, it was a rhythmic sound, like someone tapping their knuckles on the ceiling. Slowly, without realizing it, I started counting the taps, trying to stay calm. After a few minutes, I heard something that sounded like a long, dragging noise moving across the space above my apartment. That was the moment I decided I wasn't spending another night there. I started gathering some basic things with that constant feeling that any sound could start it all again. I grabbed a backpack and threw in some clothes, documents, and my phone charger, doing everything almost automatically. While I did that, the banging continued, now more spaced out, as if someone were moving slowly up there. Every sound made me stop for a few seconds, bracing for something worse. I left the apartment without turning off any lights and went down the stairs, almost running. I spent that night at a friend's house trying to explain what was happening without sounding exaggerated. She tried to rationalize it, saying old buildings make strange noises, that I must have been stressed. I wanted to believe that, but my entire body was still on edge. I barely slept, expecting to hear the banging again. The next day I went back to the building with her just to get the rest of my things. The apartment was far too quiet, a heavy silence that bothered me more than the noise. While I was packing the last boxes, I heard a single bang above me, loud and sharp. My friend heard it too and went pale instantly. There were no more after that. We left without looking back. A few days later, I managed to break the lease and never returned. To this day, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night because of any noise above me, my body reacts before my mind does. But inside, the certainty was different. Someone had entered that house more than once. Someone had unlocked the door from the inside, walked through the rooms, and touched my things. It hadn't been an accident or my mistake. It was someone who knew I worked nights and that there would be hours alone inside the house. That idea never left me in peace. I moved a few weeks later, never finding out who had entered that house. I didn't file a police report because there was nothing concrete to report. No theft, no damage, no clear evidence. To this day, what bothers me most isn't imagining someone inside my house. It's thinking about the calm it takes to unlock a door from the inside and leave as if nothing happened. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night in completely different places and check the lock more than once. Not because I'm afraid of burglars, but because I know how easy it is for someone to come in, touch everything, and leave almost nothing behind. And because I know that when it happens, you feel it before you can explain it. Story 3. I live alone in a single-story house on the outskirts of a small town in rural Oklahoma, and I've been working night shifts for several years. At the time this happened, I was 36 years old and living a very automatic routine, almost always the same. I left home in the early evening, came back early in the morning, slept for a few hours, and repeated everything again. I chose that house precisely because it was simple, quiet, and far from downtown. It was a neighborhood with wide streets, few houses, and almost no movement during the night. Because I live alone and work nights, I've always been very careful with doors and windows. I have the habit of checking the front door lock more than once before leaving. It was so automatic that I did it without even thinking. That night, before going to work, I clearly remember locking the door as usual. I got back home a little after 6 in the morning, tired, with a heavy head and my body asking for bed. The sky was still somewhat dark, with that bluish-gray tone that comes before the sun fully rises. I parked the car in front of the house and sat there for a few seconds, listening to the engine cool down. When I got out and went to the front door, something caught my attention immediately. The doorknob turned without resistance. The door was unlocked. It wasn't open or forced, just unlocked, as if someone had just arrived or left. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, trying to understand if I was really seeing that. In my mind, I was absolutely certain that I had locked it before leaving. That certainty was what made my stomach tighten instantly. I stayed outside for a few seconds, staring at the door, trying to rationalize the situation. I wondered if I could have been so tired that I forgot to lock it, but that didn't make sense. I always heard the click of the lock and tested the doorknob before leaving. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed the door open, expecting to hear some noise from inside. The house was silent, with that hollow quiet that empty houses have early in the morning. I went in and closed the door behind me, turning the key and feeling the metal lock into place. The smell was the same as always, a faint mix of old coffee and cleaning products. Nothing seemed wrong at first glance, but the feeling of alertness wouldn't go away. I stood still in the living room, looking around as if something might move at any moment. I walked slowly toward the center of the room and started noticing details. The couch was in the same place, the TV was off, everything seemed normal. But the remote control wasn't where I always left it, on top of the side table. It was on the couch, face down, a few inches out of place. It was a small detail, something many people would ignore, but it bothered me immediately. I always put the remote in the same place before leaving. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to remember if I had moved it before work. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I hadn't. I felt a slight chill run up my arms, that quiet warning that something was wrong. I walked through the house carefully, still wearing my work boots, feeling the cold floor under my feet. In the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was a chair slightly pulled away from the table. Not much, maybe 10 or 15 centimeters, but I never left it like that. I always pushed the chair under the table before leaving, almost out of habit. The sink was dry, but the sponge was twisted in a different way than usual. The dish towel, which I always left hanging on the same corner of the stove, was folded on the counter. Everything was too subtle to look like a robbery, but too specific to be random. I stood there listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, trying not to imagine someone walking around the house hours earlier. My body was tense, as if I were waiting to hear footsteps at any moment. Even so, I moved on because standing still felt worse. When I reached the hallway, the tightness in my chest increased. The door to my bedroom was open. I stopped before getting close, looking at it from a distance, trying to remember if I had left it that way. I never left my bedroom door open when I went out, not even during the day. That had always been a rule for me, without exception. The hallway light didn't fully reach inside the bedroom, leaving the space somewhat dark. I stood there for a few seconds, hearing only my own breathing. I thought about turning back and leaving the house, but at the same time I needed to know what had changed. I took a few slow steps toward the door, my heart beating faster with each one. Nothing moved, but the sense of presence was hard to ignore. I entered the bedroom slowly, looking first at the floor, then at the corners, as if someone could be hiding there. The bed was made the same way as always, the pillow in the right place, the sheet neatly stretched. But the chair in the corner, where I usually tossed my backpack, was slightly pulled out. Not much, just enough to not be touching the wall. The nightstand looked the same, but the drawer wasn't completely closed. I opened it carefully and saw that nothing was missing, just arranged differently. The keys were more to the side. The wallet wasn't exactly where I left it. I stood there trying to decide whether I was overreacting or whether it truly didn't make sense. It was as if someone had touched my things without wanting to leave obvious marks. That scared me more than if everything had been tossed around. I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, still wearing my boots, without the courage to lie down. I picked up my phone and stared at the dark screen, wondering whether I should call someone or not. The problem was explaining what. Nothing had been stolen. There were no signs of forced entry, just that feeling of silent intrusion. I looked around again, noticing things I usually wouldn't. A cushion seemed at a slightly different angle, the curtain a bit more open. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was distraction or exhaustion. But the more time I spent there, the more certain I became that someone had been in that house. Someone who wasn't in a hurry, who came in, walked around, touched things, and left calmly. That idea made it hard to breathe. I got up from the couch and went back to the front door, feeling the need to check everything again. I ran my hand near the lock and noticed faint marks on the metal, almost imperceptible. They looked like recent fingerprints, as if someone had turned the key from the inside. They weren't deep scratches, but they hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I stood there imagining someone unlocking the door from the inside, opening it carefully and leaving without making any noise. There were no signs of haste or force. Whoever did that knew the timing of the empty house. That realization gave me a strange feeling of exposure, as if my routine were too predictable. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the door, trying to keep a cool head. I was still inside the house, but I no longer felt alone. I spent the rest of the morning walking from room to room, checking windows, the back door, the garage. Everything was closed, locked, exactly as I remembered. That only made it harder to explain. I made coffee without much desire, more to keep my hands busy than because I was sleepy. While the coffee maker made noise, I stared down the hallway, waiting to hear something move. Every creak of the wood made me hold my breath for a few seconds. I sat at the table thinking about whether I should skip work that night. The idea of leaving and making the house empty again bothered me more than the exhaustion. Even so, I tried to act as if everything were normal. I went to lie down with the light on, my body exhausted but my mind on constant alert. I woke up late in the afternoon with that strange feeling of not knowing exactly how long I had slept. For a few seconds, I forgot what had happened, until I remembered the unlocked door. I got up slowly and walked through the house again, checking everything before getting ready for work. Nothing had changed since the morning, but that didn't bring any relief. Before leaving, I locked the front door with more force than usual. I tested the doorknob several times, heard the click of the lock, and stood there staring at the door. I even took out my phone and filmed the lock turning, just to be sure later. I went to work with a constant weight in my chest, trying to focus on my tasks. Every break, my mind went back to the empty house. I couldn't stop thinking about someone being there while I was gone. When I returned the next morning, the sky was bright and the neighborhood looked far too calm. I parked the car and went straight to the door, my whole body tense. The door was unlocked again. I didn't even need to turn the doorknob to realize it. I felt a chill run up my back, an immediate warning that this hadn't been my mistake. I went inside carefully and went straight to the bedroom. The door was open again, just like before. The chair had been moved a few centimeters, as if someone had sat there for a while. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken, just moved enough for me to notice. That was when I understood it wasn't going to stop and that I wasn't staying in that house anymore. I left the house that morning with a backpack on my shoulders and the feeling that I was giving up on something that would never be safe again. I went straight to a friend's house and explained the situation as simply as I could. He tried to rationalize it, talking about forgetfulness, exhaustion, the heavy routine of night shifts. I let him talk because part of me wanted to believe that too. Story 4. I am 22 years old and live in Baltimore, Maryland. At the beginning of last summer, my parents traveled for almost a month to visit relatives in Arizona, and I was left in charge of their house in a very quiet suburb, one of those places full of wide streets, tall trees, and houses that all look almost the same. I had stayed there alone before, so I didn't see a problem. I was working from home at the time, doing some freelance design work, so I spent most of the day on the computer, and at night I usually relaxed by watching TV or playing video games. Nothing out of the ordinary. The neighborhood was extremely quiet, especially at night. After 9 o'clock, you hardly saw anyone on the street, just the distant sound of a car passing by or a dog barking a few blocks away. During the first week, everything went normally. I slept in my parents' bedroom because it was the only one with air conditioning, and I left some lights on around the house out of habit. I always checked doors and windows before going to bed, more out of routine than fear. Until that specific night, I truly felt safe there. It was on a Tuesday, close to 10:30 at night, that I noticed something strange for the first time. I was in the living room, with the TV playing very quietly, when I got up to get some water in the kitchen. The kitchen faced the street and had a large window with no curtain, and that's where I saw a silhouette across the street. A man was standing on the sidewalk in front of the house across from ours. He was completely still, facing my house. At first, I thought he might be waiting for an Uber or talking on the phone, because that sometimes happens around there. I watched for a few seconds, trying to understand. The streetlight didn't help much, but I could see that he wasn't using a phone or pacing back and forth. He was just standing there with his arms hanging at his sides. What bothered me most was the amount of time. He stayed there for minutes without moving. I started to feel a mild sense of unease, but I still tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe he was a neighbor I didn't know, or someone with a problem waiting for a ride. I closed the fridge and went back to the living room, trying to ignore it. Even while trying to ignore it, it stayed in my mind. About 15 minutes later, I turned off the TV and went to the front door just to take another discreet look through the side window. The man was still there, in exactly the same spot. He didn't seem to be looking around or moving. The feeling was that he was looking straight at the house, but I couldn't tell if it was at the door, the window, or just in the general direction. My stomach tightened. That feeling you get when something doesn't seem right, but you still try to convince yourself it's nothing. I waited a bit longer, walking around the house, trying to act normal to myself. I went upstairs to the bedroom, brushed my teeth, and before lying down, I went to the window in my parents' bedroom, which gave a partial view of the street. The angle was bad, but I could still see the same spot across the street. He was still there. The street was completely empty, with no cars passing at that moment, and the silence made everything feel even stranger. I closed the curtain harder than usual and went to bed, trying not to think about it. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. I lay there listening to the low hum of the air conditioner, and every creak of the house seemed louder than normal. At some point, I woke up in the middle of the night with the strange feeling of being watched. I can't really explain it. I just felt the urge to look out the window again. I got up slowly, pulled the curtain back a little, and looked at the street. The man was no longer there. That should have relieved me, but it made me even more uneasy because I had no idea when he had left. The next day, I woke up trying to laugh at myself. During the day, the house felt normal, lit by the sun, with the distant sounds of lawnmowers and children playing on other streets. I worked normally, talked to friends on the phone, and even thought about mentioning what I had seen, but it felt like it would sound exaggerated. That night, I made a point of going out to get food, just so I wouldn't spend too much time alone in the house. When I came back, it was already dark, and I tried to convince myself that it had just been a strange coincidence. That same night, around 10 o'clock, I followed the same automatic routine around the house before sitting down in the living room. I turned off some lights, locked the front door, and went to the kitchen to get water. Before I even reached the window, I felt that cold knot in my stomach. He was there again. Exactly in the same spot across the street under the streetlight. The posture was identical to the night before, as if someone had simply pressed pause. This time I stayed longer watching, trying to identify any details. Dark clothing, maybe a hoodie, but nothing very clear. His face was always in shadow. I stood there holding the glass, my hand slightly shaking. I tried to count the time to see if he moved, shifted his weight, anything. Nothing. The street remained silent. No cars, no sounds other than the house's air conditioner. I started to wonder if he had appeared on other nights too, and I had simply not noticed. That idea made me uncomfortable in a different way, as if something had been happening without my awareness. In the following nights, it became a pattern. Always around the same time, between 10 and 10:30, I would go to the kitchen or peek through the bedroom window and see the man standing across the street. Never in a different spot. Never closer, never farther. Always that exact same point, as if he had chosen an invisible mark on the ground. I started leaving some of the inside lights off on purpose, trying to observe without being seen. But it didn't really help. The constant feeling was that he knew exactly when I was looking. My body started reacting before my mind did. I felt a tightness in my chest every time I approached the window at night. My hands would sweat, and I noticed I was holding my breath without realizing it. Even so, I kept trying to rationalize it. I thought he might be someone with mental health issues or someone who lived nearby and had a strange habit. I considered calling the police several times, but always gave up. How would I explain that there was a man standing on a public sidewalk, not doing anything illegal? On the second to last night before my parents returned, I decided to do something different. I stayed awake on purpose with all the lights in the house turned off. except for the TV, which was on very dim in the living room. I sat on the couch from where I could see the kitchen from a distance without needing to get close to the window. When the clock hit 10:20, I was already tense, waiting. Sure enough, as soon as I moved a little closer to look, I saw the silhouette in the same place as always. The difference was that this time I had the clear impression that he was looking straight into the house, not just in the general direction. That gave me a strange surge of anger mixed with fear. I thought about opening the door, yelling, asking what he wanted. I even put my hand on the doorknob, but I stopped. The house was too silent, and the idea of crossing that distance to the street in the dark made me back away immediately. I went back to the couch, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that confronting someone in that situation would be a terrible idea. I ended up falling asleep there with the TV on, without looking again. The last night was the worst of all. My parents were arriving the next morning, and I was already counting the hours. The air felt heavy, even with the air conditioner on, and I had been feeling restless since early in the evening, as if my body was already expecting something to go wrong. Around 10 o'clock, I worked up the courage and went straight to the kitchen window without hesitating. My heart raced immediately. He was no longer across the street. For a second, I felt such strong relief that I almost laughed nervously, thinking it had finally ended. That relief didn't last long. It took me a few seconds to realize the reason for the strange feeling that followed. I focused better on the glass and looked lower. The man was now at the start of my driveway, standing near the entrance where the concrete meets the sidewalk. He was much closer than before. I could see the shape of his body better, his height, his slightly hunched shoulders. He was still motionless, but now there was no doubt that he was looking directly at the house. The shorter distance made everything more real, heavier, as if the situation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I stood there, unable to move, feeling the blood pounding in my ears. The window glass reflected part of my own face, pale, eyes wide, and that only worsened the sense of unreality. I thought about calling the police, but my hands were shaking so much that it took me a moment to even get the phone out of my pocket. Meanwhile, I tried to observe more details. He didn't make any gestures, didn't knock on the door, didn't come any closer. He was just there, as if waiting for something to happen. I took a few steps back, trying to make as little noise as possible, and turned off the kitchen light. The house became almost completely dark. I went to my parents' bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, holding my phone. I called the police and explained the situation as simply as I could, my voice breaking. While I was talking, I kept imagining whether he could hear my breathing from the other side of the house, or if he was already moving without me knowing. The dispatcher said a patrol car would pass through the area, but warned that it might take a while. Those minutes felt much longer than they really were. I sat on the floor listening to every sound in the house, the click of the air conditioner, the distant noise of a car passing somewhere nearby, the soft creak of wood when I shifted position. With every unfamiliar sound, my entire body tensed, expecting to hear footsteps in the driveway or someone forcing the front door. I avoided even taking deep breaths. After some time, how long I can't really say, I gathered the courage to stand up slowly. I went to the guest room, which had a side window with a partial view of the driveway. I pulled the curtain back just enough to look. The driveway was empty. The man was no longer there. I didn't see anyone walking down the street, no shadow moving away, nothing. That didn't calm me. On the contrary, the idea that he had left without me noticing gave me a sick feeling in my stomach, as if I had lost sight of something important. About 10 minutes later, I saw red and blue lights reflecting on the walls of the house. I looked through the side window and saw the patrol car parked in front of the neighbor's house. 2 officers got out, talked briefly to each other, and then walked along the street looking around, including in the direction of my driveway. I opened the front door just enough to talk to them, trying to explain everything without sounding hysterical. They were polite, but I could tell they were trying to figure out whether this was really something serious or just someone strange passing through the area. They walked through the driveway, checked the yard, shined their flashlights along the sides of the house and across the street. One of them mentioned that they hadn't received other calls that night and that there was no suspicious person in the area at that moment. They asked if I knew any neighbor who might do something like that, or if I had argued with anyone. I said no. Before leaving, they told me to call again if I saw anything unusual. When the patrol car left and the street became dark and silent again, the feeling of being alone there became even heavier. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights in the house on, alternating between looking out the window and checking the time on my phone. The street stayed empty until morning. When the sky started to brighten, I felt a heavy exhaustion, not just from lack of sleep, but from the accumulated stress. My parents arrived around 8 in the morning, excited about their trip, and I tried to act normal. I told them what had happened in a summarized way, but it sounded strange even to me when I said it out loud. After that, I never saw the man again. Even so, whenever I go back to my parents' house and stay there at night, I avoid looking out the kitchen window after dark. Sometimes when I'm walking through the house, I still feel that tightness in my chest, as if I'm about to see someone standing across the street. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, and maybe that's what bothers me the most. He simply appeared, got closer, and then disappeared as if he had never been there at all. Story 5. I am 29 years old and live alone in a small apartment in Reno, Nevada. It's an old 3-story building, very basic, with narrow hallways, worn carpet, and thin walls. I work as a remote technical support agent, so I spend a lot of time at home, including at night. I've always been very careful about security, especially because I live alone. I lock the door, check the windows, and never leave anything open before going to sleep. My routine is very predictable and quiet. That week, I was especially tired. I had spent several days sleeping poorly because of work deadlines. That night, I went to bed around 1 in the morning. The apartment was completely dark, with only the faint streetlight coming through the living room blinds. I remember waking up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, as if something was out of place. I didn't hear any noise or see anything right away. It was just that uncomfortable sensation that something had changed while I was asleep. When I really opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the faint light entering the bedroom in a different way. My wardrobe faces the bed, and normally its door is always closed. At that moment, I could see a strange shadow projected on the wall. It took me a few seconds to understand what was wrong, still half groggy from sleep, until I realized the wardrobe door was open, completely open. I felt an immediate chill in my stomach, the kind that wakes your body faster than any alarm clock. I sat up in bed and stared, trying to understand if I myself had left it like that before going to sleep. The longer I looked, the clearer it became that it didn't make sense. Some clothes were out of place, thrown on the floor and over the chair. It wasn't normal mess. It looked like someone had pulled out specific items, as if they were looking for something inside. I got up slowly, my heart pounding, and began listening to the apartment in silence, trying to identify any unusual sound. I stood still for several minutes, trying to hear anything beyond my own heartbeat in my ears. The apartment was too quiet. There were no footsteps, voices, or the sound of the building's old elevator. I went to the bedroom door and opened it carefully, looking first toward the living room. Everything looked the same as I had left it before sleeping. The TV was off, the couch was in place, the kitchen was dark. That only increased the strange feeling, because nothing suggested an obvious break-in. I turned my attention to the front door. I walked over carefully and tried to turn the doorknob. It was locked. I checked the lock, the frame, the security chain. There were no signs of forced entry, no new scratches, nothing out of place. That left me confused and at the same time more frightened. I started to wonder if someone could have entered while I was awake and I simply didn't remember, but that idea made no sense. I always lock the door, without exception. I went back to the bedroom trying to stay calm, but my mind was already racing in every possible direction. I checked the bathroom, the small hallway, even the makeshift laundry area near the kitchen. There was no one there. No open windows, no unlocked doors. Even so, I clearly felt that I hadn't been alone minutes earlier. The idea that someone had been there touching my things while I slept made me want to run out of the apartment right then. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anything, and there were no clear signs of a break-in. Still, I took photos of the wardrobe and the clothes scattered around, more out of instinct than logic. I decided to check the building's cameras. The building manager had given me access to the app after some minor thefts in the parking lot months earlier. I sat on the couch, my heart racing, and started reviewing the overnight footage. It took me a while to find the right time, scrubbing back and forth with a trembling finger. Around 3:40 a.m., I saw something that made my stomach turn. The camera in the hallway on my floor clearly showed a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a dark cap, a hoodie zipped up to his neck, and kept his head lowered. But it was clear he wasn't any resident I recognized. He walked slowly down the hallway, stopped exactly in front of my apartment, and stayed there for a few seconds before the image cut. The camera angle didn't capture the door directly, but you could see the moment he leaned very close to it. The next video, from another camera at the end of the hallway, didn't show anyone passing anymore. There was no record of him leaving, going down the stairs, or using the elevator. I rewatched those images several times, trying to find some logical explanation. The more I watched, the clearer it became that someone had entered my apartment, and there was simply no record of them leaving. I called the police right after that. I explained everything in a low voice, almost whispering, as if someone could still be listening inside the apartment. When the officers arrived about 20 minutes later, I had already turned on all the lights and was sitting in the living room, unable to relax. I showed them the camera footage and took them to the bedroom. They looked at the wardrobe, the clothes on the floor, tested the door lock, and even checked the windows. One of them commented that there were no signs of forced entry, which made things more complicated. They went out to the hallway, spoke with the overnight doorman, and reviewed the footage more carefully. The problem was always the same. The man appeared entering the floor but never appeared leaving. One of the officers even suggested he might have entered another apartment, but they quickly ruled that out because no other doors were opened during that time frame. I listened to everything in silence, with that awful feeling that none of the answers really explained what had happened. After a few more checks, the officers said they would file a report, but they were honest in saying there wasn't much more they could do at that moment. The recommendation was obvious: change the lock, notify the building manager, and call again if something similar happened. When they left, the apartment felt even quieter than before. The feeling wasn't relief. It was as if their presence had been the last thing keeping everything under control. I tried to organize the wardrobe, but I couldn't put things back properly. Every shirt I picked up gave me the impression that someone else had held it before me. I ended up throwing everything back inside and slamming the door shut. I sat on the couch staring at the bedroom door, trying to understand how someone could have entered, gone through my things, and simply vanished inside a small building without leaving any trace. That night, I couldn't sleep anymore. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the couch with a kitchen knife beside me, which I now recognize was an exaggeration, but at the time felt like the only thing giving me any sense of control. Every creak in the building made me lift my head. The distant sound of footsteps on other floors, the elevator groaning, even the wind hitting a window in another apartment. Everything felt like a potential threat. I had the constant feeling that if I fell asleep, something would happen again. The next day, I spoke to the building manager in person. He seemed just as confused as I was. He said he had never seen that man before and that, according to the records, no external access doors had been forced. The emergency stairwells were locked, the elevator was functioning normally, and there was no common area where someone could hide for that long. He promised to reinforce security and have a specialized company review the cameras, but it sounded more like protocol than a real solution. I spent the rest of the day with that constant sense of alert, as if my body had forgotten how to relax. I changed the door lock in the late afternoon and installed an extra bolt, even knowing that didn't explain what had already happened. Every time I looked at the closed wardrobe, I remembered the image of it open in the middle of the night. The clothes scattered on the floor in a way that was far too specific to be random. It didn't look like someone searching for anything valuable. It looked like someone searching for something very specific and not finding it. A few days later, the building manager called to say that the security company also couldn't identify where the man went after appearing in the hallway. There was no obvious camera malfunction and no system outage at that time. There was simply no record of an exit. The police closed the case as an unexplained entry, which basically means nothing. To this day, I still live in the same apartment, but I never sleep with the wardrobe door open anymore, sometimes in the middle of the night. I wake up with the certainty that something has changed in the room, and I stay still, staring into the dark, afraid to confirm it. Story 6. I am 34 years old and live alone in a small house in a rural area in the interior of Missouri. It's the kind of place where houses are spread far apart, with simple fences, large yards, and dirt roads in some stretches. I work as an administrative assistant, and that week I was off, so I was spending more time at home than usual. My husband was traveling for work, and I was already used to being alone there, although I always felt a bit isolated when night fell. That night, the forecast was for a strong storm. The sky darkened early, the wind began to hit the trees, and the air felt heavy and humid. I closed all the windows, locked the doors, and tried to distract myself by watching TV. The power was already flickering, and every thunderclap made the whole house vibrate slightly. I felt uneasy, but I tried to convince myself it was just the weather. In areas like that, storms like this were common. Around 9 in the evening, the rain really started. It wasn't a steady rain, it was heavy, pounding hard on the roof and splashing up from the yard. The lightning came at short intervals, lighting everything outside for fractions of a second. During one of those flashes, I got up from the couch and went to the living room window, more on impulse than curiosity. That's when I saw someone standing near the back fence. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or the shadow of trees moving in the wind. But with the next flash, it was far too clear to ignore. It was a man standing near the fence that separates my property from the neighbors. He was completely still, facing the house, with his arms hanging at his sides. I recognized almost immediately that it was the neighbor from behind my house, a man who had always made me uneasy. We were never close, just a few quick nods from a distance, and I had always felt something was off about him. I stood there staring, trying to understand what he could be doing in the yard in that rain. The wind shook the trees. Water ran down the fence, but he didn't move. No steps, no gestures. With each lightning flash, I confirmed he was still in exactly the same place. That started to give me physical discomfort, a knot in my stomach, because there was no reason for someone to stand like that in the dark during a storm. I tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe he was checking the fence or some issue with his land. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If that were the case, he would be walking, using a flashlight, doing something. Instead, he was just staring at the house. I closed the curtain forcefully and stepped away from the window, feeling my heart race. The feeling of being watched didn't go away when I stopped looking. I went back to the couch, trying to convince myself it had just been an impression amplified by fear and the storm. The TV was still on, but I wasn't paying attention to anything. Every thunderclap made my body react before the sound even fully arrived. A few minutes later, the house lights flickered twice, and then everything went dark. The sound of the rain seemed louder without the TV. The silence inside the house felt heavy, broken only by the wind and the rain hitting the walls. I went to the kitchen to get a flashlight I kept in a drawer. When I turned it on, that weak yellowish light only increased the sense of isolation. I walked slowly through the house, checking the doors. The front door was locked, the back door too. Even so, I felt a growing unease, like something was about to happen. That's when I heard a sound different from the rest of the storm. A rhythmic, muffled noise coming from the backyard. It sounded like footsteps on wet ground. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a branch breaking or something being dragged by the wind. But the footsteps continued, slow, heavy, moving closer to the house. I could distinguish the sound of water being pushed with each step. My heart started beating so hard I could feel it in my neck. I instinctively turned off the flashlight and stood still in the middle of the kitchen, listening, trying to understand the direction of the sound in the dark. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, and then I heard something that made me freeze completely. A solid impact on the back door. It wasn't a light push. It was strong, like someone testing its resistance. Right after, another one, even more forceful. The doorknob started moving violently, shaking the door. There was no doubt someone was trying to get in. My body froze for a moment before fear made me react. I ran to the bedroom almost without feeling my feet touch the floor. I locked the door and pressed my back against it, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers hurt. The house felt too small in that moment, and every sound of the storm mixed with the noise of the back door being forced. I heard another impact, followed by a dry scraping sound, like something scratching the wood or the frame. I tried to breathe slowly, but the air didn't seem to fill my chest properly. I called the police with a trembling voice, trying to explain where I was and what was happening while listening to the noises in the background. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, but the signal began to fail because of the storm. At one point, the noise at the door simply stopped. That sudden silence was worse than the noise. I stayed there, motionless, trying to hear anything beyond the rain, with the clear feeling that someone was still on the other side of the house. I stayed in that position for several minutes, not knowing if it was safe to move. The silence was broken only by distant thunder and the wind hitting the trees. I gathered the courage and, still speaking quietly with the dispatcher, left the bedroom slowly. I used my phone's flashlight to light the hallway. Every step felt too loud. When I reached the kitchen, I smelled a strong scent of wet earth coming through the crack of the back door, as if someone had just passed by. I looked through the small window in the door, trying to see something in the yard. Another lightning flash lit everything for a second, and it was enough for me to see that the fence gate was open. It was always kept closed, secured with a simple wire. The neighbor was no longer near the fence. He wasn't anywhere in the yard. That gave me a different kind of fear, deeper, because it meant he had been much closer to the house than I wanted to admit. The police took longer than I would have liked, but they eventually arrived while the storm was still strong. The patrol car lights cut through the darkness of the yard, and for the first time since it started, I felt a slight sense of relief. 2 officers knocked on the front door, and I could barely unlock it because I was so nervous. I told them everything right there all at once, pointing to the yard, the open fence, the back door still marked with mud. They inspected everything with flashlights, walked through the soaked ground, and spoke quietly to each other. They went to the neighbor's house shortly after. I could see from a distance through the window when they knocked on his door. It took a while, but he eventually answered. Even from afar, I recognized the rigid posture, the strange way he stood still, just like I had seen in the yard. One of the officers came back later and said the man claimed he had been home all night sleeping and hadn't gone out because of the storm. There wasn't enough evidence to do anything else at that moment. After the police left, the storm began to weaken, but I no longer felt safe inside that house. The yard was completely churned up by the rain, with footprints mixed into the mud, but nothing clear enough to prove anything. The officers said it could have been caused by the storm itself. Even so, I knew the difference between watermarks and the marks of someone walking there. That explanation didn't convince me for a second. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, with all the lights on, listening to the sound of the rain gradually fading. I couldn't close my eyes. Every time the wind moved something outside, my body reacted as if I were about to hear footsteps again. When the day began to lighten, I carefully went to the back door. There were fresh mud marks near the doorknob, right at hand height. They hadn't been there before the storm. When my husband returned 2 days later, I told him everything calmly, trying not to sound desperate. He tried to reassure me, said maybe the neighbor had just been crossing the property for some strange reason, or that the storm had confused everything. Even as he spoke, I could see he didn't seem fully convinced either. I showed him the marks on the door, the open fence, and the exact spot where I had seen the man standing. He stayed silent for far too long. After that night, I was never able to look at the yard the same way when it gets dark. The neighbor continued living there, and his behavior didn't change. Sometimes I see him standing on his property looking toward my house for a few seconds before going inside. He never said anything, never tried to make contact. Nothing else happened, but that almost makes it worse. Because I know what I saw that night, I know the sound of footsteps approaching the door, and I know someone tried to get in while I was alone. And to this day, when a strong storm starts, I lock everything early and avoid getting close to the windows. Story 7. I am 31 years old and live alone in a semi-detached house in a very ordinary residential neighborhood in Pennsylvania. It's one of those quiet streets with old houses, narrow sidewalks, and few streetlights that work properly at night. I work as a remote data analyst, so I often stay up through the night working, especially when I have tight deadlines. That particular week, I was adjusting reports for a West Coast client, so my schedule was completely reversed. That night I was home alone, as usual. The street was completely silent with no cars passing, just the distant sound of a train far away. The house was almost entirely dark, with only the office light on and a dim lamp in the hallway. Everything else was off. Around 3 in the morning, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. Nothing strange about that. I was tired, with a heavy head, but still fully awake. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway near the door that led to the basement. As I walked toward it, I noticed how the house felt too quiet. The kind of silence that makes any small sound seem loud. I went into the bathroom, turned on the light and closed the door behind me, more out of habit than necessity. The exhaust fan wasn't on, so everything stayed quiet, just the faint hum of the ceiling light. That's when I heard the breathing. It came clearly from the other side of the door. It wasn't a quick sigh or a distant noise from the house. It was deep, slow, heavy breathing, as if someone were standing right there with their face close to the wood. I froze instantly. I stood there without moving, listening to that sound going in and out, clearly defined. My heart started racing, and the first thing I thought was that someone had entered the house without me noticing. I stayed there for a few seconds that felt much longer, trying to understand if it could be some house noise, pipes, wind, anything. But it didn't fit. The breathing had a rhythm that was far too human. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice, and said something simple, almost automatic, like, "Is there someone there?" At that exact moment, the breathing stopped. It didn't fade or move away. It simply ceased, as if someone had deliberately held their breath. The silence that followed was worse. I stared at the door, waiting to hear footsteps moving away or any other sound that might explain it. Nothing. The bathroom felt too small, and I began to feel that cold heat run down my back, sweat forming without me realizing it. I waited a few more seconds, trying to gather courage, and then slowly unlocked the door, already prepared to see someone on the other side. I opened it all at once, my heart pounding, and the hallway was empty. The dim lamp lit everything exactly as before. There was no one standing there, no one hiding, no movement. I looked to both sides, then again toward the end of the hallway, trying to accept what I was seeing. The house remained silent. That didn't calm me. On the contrary, the total lack of any explanation made me even more alert. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to hear anything at all. Nothing but my own breathing, now rapid. I went back to the office without even finishing what I had gone to the bathroom for. I sat down in the chair, but I couldn't go back to work. It felt like something had changed inside the house. I started mentally reviewing all the doors and windows, trying to remember if I had locked everything before starting work that night. I was almost certain I had. A few minutes later, I got up to check the house. I went to the front door first. It was locked exactly as I remembered. The living room windows were also closed. I passed through the kitchen, the bedroom. Everything looked normal. I tried to laugh at myself, thinking maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Even so, my body wouldn't relax. The feeling of being watched remained, as if I had interrupted someone who didn't want to be noticed. That's when I noticed something different at the end of the hallway. The basement door was open. Not wide open, but open enough to reveal the beginning of the stairs descending into darkness. I stopped immediately. That door was always kept closed because the basement was damp and had a strong, moldy smell. I had a habit of checking it every night, precisely to avoid noise or smells coming up. I was absolutely certain it had been closed before. I stood there for a few seconds staring at that dark gap, trying to decide if I had really forgotten to close it. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I hadn't. The basement had always made me uncomfortable, and I never left that door open, especially in the middle of the night. The house suddenly felt colder, as if air from the basement were rising into the hallway. A faint smell of damp earth and dust came from there, something I only noticed when I went down the stairs. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it downward. The light didn't reach much beyond the first few steps. The rest was just darkness. I stood there listening. At first, nothing. After a few seconds, I heard a very low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from below. It wasn't a clear step or a creak of the house. It sounded more like a restrained movement, as if someone were shifting their weight to avoid making noise. My stomach dropped instantly, My whole body went on alert. I stood at the top of the stairs holding the phone with both hands, trying to decide if that sound was real or just my mind filling the emptiness with fear. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence that followed felt forced, as if someone had realized I was there. I thought about calling out, saying anything out loud, but the idea of revealing my position froze me. It felt like any wrong reaction could make things worse. I took a few steps back slowly, never taking my eyes off the basement door. I closed it carefully, trying not to make noise until I heard the soft click of the simple latch. I rested my forehead against the wood for a second, breathing deeply, trying to calm my heart. That's when I noticed something else strange. The house was completely silent without the distant sound of the heater or pipes. It felt like everything had stopped along with me. I went back to the office, unable to relax. I sat in the chair with my back to the wall, facing the door, as if that gave me some control over the situation. The computer clock read almost 4 in the morning. I tried to focus on work, but any creak of the house made me lift my head immediately. My breathing was shallow, and I realized I was listening more than looking, waiting for some sound that would confirm I wasn't alone. A few minutes later, I heard a light creak coming from the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it was different from the usual house noises. It sounded like wood being slowly pressed. I got up again and went to the office door, opening it just a crack. The hallway was empty, but the basement door, which I had just closed, was once again ajar. Not much, just enough to let that dark strip show between the door and the frame. I felt a knot form in my stomach instantly. That was when I truly panicked. There was no way to pretend anymore that this had a simple explanation. I had closed the door, I had heard the click, and yet it was open again. I stood there in the hallway, feeling my legs grow weak, trying to hear anything coming from the basement. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing. Just that heavy emptiness, as if someone were deliberately standing still, waiting for me to make a move. I quietly grabbed my car keys, phone, and wallet and went straight to the front door. I didn't think about taking anything else. I opened the door carefully, stepped outside, and locked it behind me without looking back in. I got into the car and started the engine with shaking hands. I sat there on the street for a few minutes, staring at the front of the house, waiting to see a light turn on or someone appear at the door. Nothing happened. The house looked exactly as it always did. I stayed outside for a while. How long, I can't really say. Just trying to get my breathing back to normal. The street was empty and silent, all the houses dark. There was no sign that anything was wrong, which almost made me doubt myself. Even so, I couldn't go back inside. I drove to a 24-hour diner a few minutes away and sat in the car with the engine off, staring at my phone without really seeing anything. I still felt that tension in my body, as if I were about to hear something again at any moment. When the sky started to lighten a bit, I carefully returned home. I went in slowly, lights off, listening to every sound. The house was exactly as I had left it. The basement door this time was closed. I opened it carefully, just enough to look. I didn't see anyone down there. There was no obvious sign that anyone had been there. Even so, the damp smell seemed stronger than usual, and I had the clear feeling that I was looking into a space where I shouldn't stay for long. I spent the rest of the morning awake, unable to sleep. The more I tried to rationalize it, the fewer explanations made sense. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place except the basement door. I mentally replayed the entire night over and over, trying to find a moment when I might have imagined the breathing or forgotten to close the door, but nothing fit. The breathing had been too clear, too close, and it had stopped at the exact moment I spoke. That wouldn't leave my mind. To this day, I still live in that house, but I never stay up working through the night there anymore. I always lock the basement door now, even during the day. Sometimes when I walk down the hallway at night, I still pause for a second before going to the bathroom, listening in the absolute silence, afraid of hearing that sound again on the other side of the door. Nothing like it has ever happened again, and maybe that's the worst part, because there was no explanation, no confirmation of anything, just the uncomfortable certainty that, for a few minutes that early morning, I was not alone inside my own house.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, Don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.